So if you've been living under a rock, what happened is China has this thing they call zero COVID, right? Which means whenever there is a single case of COVID somewhere, they lock down like a ton of the surrounding area, sometimes for months at a time. The point of lockdowns originally was not so much to eliminate the disease, because that might have been possible at some point, but at a certain point, it just becomes functionally impossible because, some people still need to go to work to keep things running for everyone else. Those people are going to contract the disease and shit. People have to go outside to go shopping and shit so that they can survive in lockdown, stuff like that. There's still community transmission of the disease no matter what you do. It's impossible for everyone to just sit in a house forever. Past a certain point, past the beginning of the epidemic, which then became a pandemic, it might have been possible to eliminate the virus completely, but very quickly that became not realistic. So what the original lockdowns were really for was to mitigate the number of cases, to keep the healthcare system able to handle the amount of people that were coming in while people were getting vaccinated and while people were generating some level of immunity through the milder infections. And lockdowns worked well for that. But any notion that lockdowns could have completely eliminated the virus past, the first month of its discovery, that's not really what it was for. So China now has a very weird, very overbearing policy of lockdowns in entire areas when even one case is discovered somewhere, of places where millions of people live in large parts of cities and shit like that. And at this point, the virus is endemic. You're not going to eliminate it entirely. People should already be vaccinated enough to mitigate some of its worst and most widespread consequences. You can't eliminate the virus. China, however, with their zero COVID policy, kind of trying to still, which you can't. And obviously, people in China, a lot of them are fed up with one person getting COVID, so now they have to be stuck at home for months at a time as a result. That's obviously stupid and dumb. And the catalyst for the protest was a fire in Urumqi in Xinjiang, which killed 10 people, which some people are blaming on the government, some people not, whatever. Doesn't really matter, because the perception is that spurred the protest is that it happened because of the zero COVID policies, because of these harsh lockdowns. If you were in this situation, you would be protesting too. I want to make that clear. You would also be pissed off, you would be protesting, you would be complaining. So for the people who are like, these protests are the result of evil foreign forces or whatever. No, these protests are the result of a fucking idiotic policy that people are fed up of. Trying to frame them as the same as anti-lockdown protests a year or two ago is obviously absurd, because they're not the same thing at all. We're in a completely different stage of the pandemic now, where the disease has basically just become endemic. It's going to be around forever. It's not going away. And there's nothing we can do about that. All that we can do is try to mitigate it, try to keep vaccines as updated as possible and keep people getting vaccinated basically forever. It's similar to what you should ideally have always been doing for the flu. You should always be getting an updated flu vaccine every year. But obviously COVID is more severe than the flu. So it's even more important that you do so with COVID. This is how it's going to be. And of course, you're going to have idiotic people here who basically just live their lives of treating China like it's their favorite sports team. And they have to justify every single little thing the Chinese government does. So they can't even admit the basic fact that human beings are probably going to be pissed off when 3 years in, or 2.5 years into a pandemic, they're still getting locked up into their houses for months at a time, and they haven't been able to resume their normal lives. So yeah, people are fucking angry. Obviously, that's why people are protesting. You'd be angry too. You'd probably be protesting too. So the notion that this is some sort of evil protest spurred by China's enemies, again, by foreign interference, as if Chinese people are so fucking stupid that they need to be told by the CIA that being locked up in your house for 2 months at a time because one person got COVID isn't very fun. I live in Argentina. We have mRNA vaccines here in abundance, in bulk. We have more of them now than the demand for them. Argentina is a third world country, okay? China has far more power in the global market than Argentina does, okay? If it doesn't have the better vaccines, it's because of a choice of the government, not because they don't have access to them. We're well past the point where vaccine access is a massive issue. It was a massive issue a long time ago. Now there are vaccines in abundance, and the issue is convincing people to take them or not. So the protests in China are obviously completely understandable, completely fine too. And it's incredibly stupid that the Chinese government would let them become an issue at all like this, rather than just being like, hey, we're going to stop doing the dumb thing that we're doing that people don't like, which would obviously be the easiest way to remedy this problem. So their own stupid actions here in maintaining this policy is giving the Western press ammo to attack them, with which they then claim, because the Western press is attacking them over this, obviously as because they will take advantage of any protest in China, that means that the protests are the cause of foreign agents. It's like a fucking feedback loop. Circular logic. And the Chinese government's usual excuse here, which they're going with and which they always go with, and which a lot of their fans online loves to go with too, is that it's the regional government's fault. It's the regional government's fault. It's not the central government's fault. The regional government is not simply following the policy instituted by the central government. Rather, the regional government is doing the thing that the central government said badly. And that's the issue here. That's what people are protesting about. The problem is the policy itself. Zero COVID is fucking stupid. It made sense 2 years ago, a year ago. It doesn't make sense anymore. And of course, another talking point that some people like to use is, hey, look, there's like 2 protesters calling for the overthrow of the government, which the Western media loves to point to as well. And the thing is, in any protest about anything, you will find anywhere in the world, you will find some people calling for the overthrow of the government. Like, give me a fucking break. You could find that in any like protest in the West or whatever. Does that mean the protests are illegitimate and instituted by foreign forces? Or does it just mean that people are targeting the government that is instituting the policies that they don't like in that moment? I mean, if they're offering to sell them the vaccines without giving the patent, obviously that's less ideal than getting the patent, but buy them anyway. If your only option is to buy the vaccines without them giving you the means to make them yourself, and the other option is to just not buy them, buy them. Yeah, it's morally wrong for them not to give you the patent, but you don't have another option. The other option is not to have the vaccines. China usually does lots of things based on public pressure. Like the Chinese government 5 years ago, if they saw protests half as big as these, they would have immediately changed course. Things have changed in China. The government is becoming less and less responsive, and that's not a good thing. I mean, the Chinese vaccine is cheap, easy to make, and reasonably effective. It's just not as good as like a lot of the other ones. Not all of them. It's not as good as some of the other ones. It's far better than nothing. Infinitely better than nothing. I mean, if people aren't getting vaccinated at this point in China or anywhere else, though, it's a choice. It's their choice. Okay, you can get vaccinated anywhere in the world, either with like the Chinese vaccines, which aren't the best, but are still obviously better than nothing by a lot, or with some other vaccine, whatever. Almost anywhere in the world. Perhaps some really poor countries in Africa don't have high level of vaccine access, but China isn't one of them. China produces their own vaccines in bulk. So at this point, if people aren't vaccinated, it's their own fucking fault. And you cannot just keep people in lockdown for fucking ever because some dipshits don't want to get vaccinated. You see, the big difference between the anti-lockdown movements in like other countries is that they weren't anti-lockdown movements. They were pro-COVID movements. They didn't give a fuck about COVID at all. They were anti-vaccine, anti-everything. These protests are only happening 2.5 years deep into the pandemic, while China is still instituting a completely stupid policy that no one else is even remotely close to doing. At this point, if someone who isn't vaccinated dies from COVID, if they catch COVID because there was no lockdown, I don't care. Obviously, some people who are vaccinated are still going to die. Some people are going to get the disease. They're going to have long-term effects as a result of getting the disease. But the only alternative to that is to literally, every single time there's a COVID case all over the world, go into an immediate snap, massive lockdown of millions of people. At this point, that's just not a realistic way to handle things. It's not going to work. The disease is everywhere. The disease is fucking everywhere. There are still tens of thousands, hundreds of cases per day, 100,000 cases per day the world over. It's incredibly unlikely this is going to be changing. And all of this is because at the beginning of the pandemic, not just China, but everyone else waited too long to take the correct measures against it. And when they did take them, they were not even remotely as strict as they should have been. And even then, it's probably unlikely that we ever could have completely eliminated this disease, considering how massively contagious it is and how tons of people still need to keep interacting with others every single day in order to keep things running for the people who are in lockdown. So what China is doing now makes no sense whatsoever. We're not 6 months into the pandemic anymore. We have vaccines. We have some degree of so-called herd immunity, just as a way to put it. You know, some people have a bit of natural immunity from previous infections, obviously not quite as good as the vaccines. So we can mitigate the effects of the virus, but it is going to be circulating for a very long time. Vaccine program started 2 fucking years ago. Give me a break. If China does not have a sufficient amount of people vaccinated right now, that is a failure of the central government. The level of control that China has, as well as the fact of it being a producer of vaccines, a mass producer of vaccines, there's no excuse. Now, I know how this works. People just come up with any sort of desperate excuse to defend literally anything from like a government that they treat like their sports team. It doesn't matter. So, when I post this on YouTube, there's going to be people just coming up with the most batshit crazy shit in the comments to make an excuse for this, being like, oh my God, I can't believe you would back the US imperialists against China or whatever. I think in advocating for the Chinese government to not have stupid fucking policies that everyone hates, I'm actually helping them against the US imperialists, because a great way to not give the US imperialists ammo against you is to not institute dumb fucking policies that everyone hates, that people then protest about, that the US imperialists can then use as propaganda in their media against you. Great fucking tactic there. 90% of India's adult population is fully vaccinated against COVID-19. 90%. Look, if India, run by a neoliberal fascist government, can get 90% of its population vaccinated, even if the vaccines aren't the best ones, any country can. So yeah, every facet of this is the Chinese government's fault. It doesn't matter if you want to try to blame outside forces. It doesn't matter if others are trying to take advantage of the situation to push the protest as something that they're largely not or whatever. It's the Chinese government's fault for having a shitty fucking policy that everyone hates. It's also the Chinese government's fault if they haven't yet managed to get like 90% plus vaccination of the general population of adults. It's also their fault, because they're the ones who are making the vaccines. They're the ones who are disseminating the vaccines. It's their job to convince people to get vaccinated. They're fucked up in many ways. They might have had a very good response in terms of lockdown, but clearly in other, the initial lockdown, I mean, but clearly in other facets, they're fucked up. And people are just completely, like, China supporters are just completely, like, irrationally allergic to pointing out when the Chinese government's fucked up. It must be for some other reason. It must be that they're actually doing the right thing and they're just being unfairly maligned by foreign agents or whatever. People protest in China all the time. It's not true that Chinese people don't protest at all. But usually when people in China protest, the government tries to do something about what they're protesting. This time, the government's response is just to keep doing what they've already been doing. That's not a good thing. I'm not the only one who's noted this too. There are actual Chinese scholars who publish from China, by the way, who often write articles on government responsiveness in China, which they initially started writing in order to prove that the Chinese government is actually more responsive to public opinion than Western governments, because Western governments don't need to care about public opinion except during election cycles, whereas Chinese governments are under a lot of pressure all the time to maintain their legitimacy. So, they ran studies that showed that usually the Chinese government is as responsive to public demands or more responsive to public demands than Western governments are. And in general, a lot of these people, the same people who used to publish that, have been finding that in the last 5, 6, 7 years, this has been changing. Rather than being responsive to protests and criticism, they arrest people more. They censor more. And if you think that's a good thing, then I don't know. I don't think you can really claim to be that you support the Chinese government because it represents the interests of the people as much as you think it does. So China was also, by the way, the world's biggest vaccine exporter. So they clearly have supply. The problem is, if their vaccination rate is low, for example, I just saw 65% in the elderly, it's because people aren't getting the vaccine. Now, should you lock down the entire country because some people don't want to get vaccinated? Should you just lock down the entire country forever to save those people who refuse to get the vaccine? I think past a certain point, you have to say, no, fuck that. If they want to make their bed, they can sleep in it. It's that simple. I mean, you can't just lock down people who haven't been vaccinated, because for one, enforcing that is a fucking nightmare. For two, people who are vaccinated still spread the disease. Vaccinations are for making it so that when you get the disease, you have a much smaller chance of getting severe symptoms or death. But yeah, that's my take on China. It's going to make a lot of fucking morons mad, but honestly, I'm not here to cater to people whose entire being is pointing at people who just say the thing they want to hear and then say based, and pointing to people who say the thing they don't like to hear and say cringe. It's fucking stupid to maintain the policy of zero COVID at this point in the pandemic. And obviously people in China are fucking tired of it. And that's why they're protesting, not because they're being paid by foreign CIA, NED, USAID agents. Give me a fucking break. Yeah, I mean, lockdown fucking sucks. It's something that people were willing to do, most people at least who aren't pieces of shit, were willing to do while we were getting vaccines out. Okay, vaccines are out. They've been out for a long time. Most people, aside from some much poorer countries, are vaccinated, or at least should be vaccinated by this point. And if they're not, it's really their own fault. So should everyone be locked down forever to save those people when the vast majority of people have been vaccinated and are far less likely to experience any severe consequences as a result of getting COVID? Should everyone just be locked down forever because of those assholes? Past a certain point, individual responsibility does come into play, and that is where, like, give me a fucking break. Unless you want to just strap those people down and forcibly vaccinate them, which China doesn't even do. What can you do? No, everyone needs to give me cash.